Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining us again today is Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance and The Last American Vagabond to actually catch us up on a couple of topics that we haven't covered, including the very interesting conversation of the UN 2.0 and the future, the summit of the future, which I'm fascinated about and terrified about at the same time, because it seems to be kind of, in my eyes, getting ahead of a lot of the negative attention the UN's been getting and kind of reimagining the UN like everything else. We'll talk about his recent articles on Bethany Christian Services, his recent interviews, and what he saw at the Libertarian Convention, and a lot of other important things if we had time to get to it. Always a pleasure to speak with you, Derrick. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing great, brother. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, I think I'm really fascinated by this, UN 2.0 conversation, because it seems like there's so many, in my opinion, and maybe this is just from our circle, but it seems like most people in the world are becoming uncomfortably aware that the UN is not really in the interest of sovereignty at the very least. And now with the whole Great Reset overlap, the COVID-19 conversation. So we can go ahead and start there in general, because this is an interesting conversation that I'm glad you're covering, and I think it deserves a lot more attention. And you've really been on this in general, kind of keeping up with the new, like whether it's the Great Reset or the UN, kind of these globalist meetings where they have it focused on censorship at one point, or actually one thing you pointed out with one of the titles was about like the global government conversation, even though it's considered a conspiracy theory. There's so many of these. So let's start with this in general. The Summit of the Future, you wrote this for the Conscious Resistance. The Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future will rapidly expand the technocratic takeover. So go ahead and tell us about what this is, and we'll start there with the Summit of the Future.
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually a great time to be having this conversation, because right now the Bilderberg Group is meeting in Spain, and I know there's some independent journalists there. That's, of course, another really important and more secretive group that is, even though they've become more public in the last 5 years or so, they've still kind of behind the scenes and less public and less open than the World Economic Forum, which is, of course, getting a lot of attention. And also there are activists right now in Geneva, Switzerland, rallying, opposing the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty, accord, agreement, whatever you want to call, which we know did not reach the completion stage just yet. So there's a lot of important things happening on this international stage. And from Bilderberg and from the World Health Organization pandemic treaty, I would say the next major major globalist gathering is going to be this Summit of the Future in New York City in September. And this is, of course, part of the larger United Nations General Assembly. Out of that General Assembly, which will be meeting for a week, 2 days of it, the 22nd and 23rd of September, are dedicated to what they're calling the Summit for the Future, where they're going to sign the Pact for the Future. And obviously, it sounds like a pretty big deal, and it absolutely is. As you mentioned, UN 2.0, there's numerous documents from various UN-affiliated organizations and the UN themselves talking about it's time to invoke a specific element of the UN Charter to essentially recreate the UN. And they're using the words UN 2.0. They're also saying that we need to give the UN more power. It started with this there you go, the Summit of the Future document. And in my article there for the Conscious Resistance, I look at a little bit of the history. This goes back to the UN 75th anniversary, which is, of course, coincidentally 2020, right? When COVID was happening, the UN started declaring their 75th anniversary, and the nation states, the member states, said they wanted Secretary General Antonio Guterres to come up with a document of his own, a report of his own, to describe how the UN could be upgraded for the future. And as I've been reporting for TLAV for over a year now, they've been, complaining that they're not on target for the Sustainable Development Goals, and saying we need to come up with new ways to achieve this, including injecting more money into it and doing all kinds of other things. So it's sort of a continuation of that conversation. Well, after that 75th declaration, Antonio Guterres did indeed create a document. It's called Our Common Agenda. And it was Our Common Agenda where he first said we should have this meeting in a couple of years from now, which now we're coming up on. And you can see on the UN websites, they even have like a timeline that all builds towards the Summit of the Future. Last year, September 2023, they had the Sustainable Development Summit, and they again talked about recommitting to the Sustainable Development Goals, all part of the 2030 Agenda, or what people more commonly know as Agenda 2030, which is really the remake. It's just another way of saying the Great Reset. This is redesigning the world using buzzwords and flowery language about diversity and sustainability and equity and resilience and such, but really a lot of it's about getting people on digital IDs, freedom of choice and privacy, basic fundamental things that I think people hearing this care about, right? So this is, in many ways, it's more of the same, everything we've seen before, but I also do think this is a stepping up of the agenda. And this is why I've been giving it so much attention. This is why I wrote this fairly extensive article diving into the history and trying to show people what they're actually talking about. And we can go into my report and you can read the quotes from themselves where they say several times that this is about trying to move past nation states and it's about trying to have stronger international, supranational bodies.
Yeah, and at first, I just think, again, to reiterate, I think it's interesting that you can see a shifting of perception around a lot of this. I mean, really from all sides. You've got arguments about how, whether it's about foreign policy or the Great Reset, which is kind of the difference, I would say, from left-right paradigm perspectives, it seems that people are, at least questioning whether the UN as it, in a general sense, or what it's become, or, the people in charge of the different, like the US, Israel kind of veto power kind of conversation, that it's not in the interest of sovereignty or what, even international law, but that's, debated. But I think what's interesting is this feels like a way to reimagine itself to kind of get away from that perception, and I think that is what's happening a lot, which I think is indicative of a larger shift where, whether it's foreign policy or medical freedom, that average Americans at the very least, I think, seem to be questioning things that they haven't for a long time. And that's a very positive step. And so a lot of this reimagining in my eyes is about trying to get away from that. To what you highlighted, one of the things that really stood out to me was the quote, one of the quotes you're referencing. It says the UN 2.0, as they're framing this, is about upgrading expertise in innovation, data, digital, foresight, and behavioral science, which I found really interesting. And what your thoughts on that, to enhance UN system results, help build similar member state expertise, and accelerate shared progress, of course, toward the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the document also calls for a global financial system that works for all. So give me what is that, in your eyes, what does that mean? The digital part, the data, the behavioral science, what does that all mean to you?
It could be references to some of the same things Klaus Schwab talks about when he says the fourth industrial revolution. As we know, and as I've reported for TLAV over the years, that there's definitely a genetic element to this whole, the transhumanist element towards this transformation of the future. And I'll remind everybody that back in 2020, the United Nations declared this the decade of transformation. And this is before COVID happened, the very beginning of 2020, they said that this was going to be the decade that we transform the world. And Great Reset was announced, of course, shortly after that, this UN 75th Declaration. A lot of it relates to transhumanism. It relates to, this is why you see the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, talking about the metaverse, talking about digital IDs. And of course, the way that they phrase it, they'll say things like we need to get access to DNA and to genetic profiles of people in order to better develop vaccines, to better develop medicines, et cetera, like that. And that is surely part of it. I mean, I've reported on this as well, the fact that companies like, just as an example, 23andMe promote themselves as DNA testing companies, find out who you're related to, et cetera, look at your family history, and then more recently announcing that they're actually a pharmaceutical company, and now they're going to be using the DNA that people have voluntarily handed over to develop DNA-targeted medicines and things of that sort. Of course, they could develop DNA-targeted weapons as well, or other things if they wanted. My point, I think that reference to behavioral science, data, et cetera, is probably along that same vein. And in the second line that you highlighted, I think that kind of gets even more to the core of what this is about. People who've been paying attention know that the financial system around the world, but especially in the United States, is crumbling, largely because of the Federal Reserve, but also because of the inflation post-COVID that Trump brought about, and the printing of money at just accelerated rates. In fact, many people have argued that the entire COVID operation was just another way to stave off the collapse of the economy that was already on its way out, and to kind of paper over some of the things that were already going on by printing more money and keeping it alive a little longer. The point being, we know they want a new financial system, and that's absolutely what this document talks about from the United Nations. So I think that the pact to the future, in addition to whatever sort of buzzwords they put in there about sustainability, et cetera, there might be some major steps taken towards a new financial system. And I've reported on this in past articles for TLAV as well, that they keep talking about the Bretton Woods moment. We need a new Bretton Woods moment. And for those who are unaware, that was the creation of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and moving most of the world onto the dollar as a reserve currency. A lot of big things happen at the original Bretton Woods moment. And so they keep saying this, that it's time for a new Bretton Woods moment. The IMF is saying this themselves, the UN is saying it. They are really trying to push to a point of recreating the financial system.
Right. And of course, in an interesting way, your digital ID aspect point to that. I mean, I think that's hard not to see the overlap where obviously and you pointed this out many times, under the guise of accessibility or equality, they drive these things in, and like, we need the system for everybody, but of course you would need your digital ID to access this, or in any number of ways. You can see how that's sort of the same game, and the question becomes, is that really what everybody wants or even needs? Or is this just really what benefits them in particular? To add to one of the points you made as well, which I think is interestingly popping back up in the conversation right now. You highlighted this all the way back in 2021, the Bill Gates, BGI, China, 23andMe, your DNA aspect, and how this all overlap with a lot of different agendas. I'll include that for people to read into. It's very important. And I also pointed out the COVID coup, the BlackRock takeover American interest, which was a BlackRock plan that was created before COVID. It was the same kind of thing, like the using of the COVID agenda to do what they were already planning to do, in my opinion. But I think that the most alarming part, the global financial system that works for all, a lot of people will fall for that, to think that this is something that's about equality, making sure that the global South can have access to the same things we do. It's amazing that we can't take a second to ask whether that's even something that these other nations actually want, or if it's in their interest. Historically, the U.S. government has always used the idea of whether it's finances or human rights, to take advantage of foreign countries for their interest, literally at the expense of the people in those countries. And so I don't know why anybody would take this.
Yeah, could I add to that real quick?
Absolutely, go ahead.
I don't even know if I included this in the article, but I know I tweeted about it while I was researching this article. But there was at least a couple African nations, and definitely I remember Cuba, the representative there. So they're still having these meetings for the Summit of the Future. There was one as recent as just April, like right as I was writing the article. So I included some quotes from there. And absolutely what you're talking about, Ryan, is happening. There, the rep from Cuba and the rep from these other African nations said, we weren't consulted at all. None of our suggestions were used. We were been pretty much ignored in this process. So one of the things I was coming to realize, and I've thought about this before, but it became even more clear as I was researching the Summit of the Future, that a lot of times I think we assume that the flowery buzzwords and language is all about deceiving the public. And I think that's part of it. But also, as we know, most of the public doesn't pay attention to the UN meetings and things like that. It's only people like us who are really knee deep in this stuff that are trying to share it with the people and say, hey, look what they're talking about. But I think the language is also about convincing the third world nations, the developing nations, to go along with this, because they have votes, and they could, just like we saw with the World Health Organization treaty, they could disrupt it for one reason or another if they don't like it. They need especially if they're going to invoke the UN Charter to try to create a whole new UN, they need buy-in from every single country. And so when you see these developing countries, these so-called third world countries saying our voices aren't being heard, it's a repeat of what we've seen for decades and decades. What people like, I can't remember his name right now, but economic hitman Perkins, what's his name? John Perkins. And, he talked about his experience directly. And we know this by now, that the IMF and the World Bank, they'll go offer loans to developing nations. They get them locked into loans. And once they default on that payment, they're like, okay, well, you owe us all this money. We're going to come take your resources. They're doing similar things now. They're calling it debt for nature swaps and all this sort of fun things where they allow big corporations or billionaires to offset their carbon credits by, buying one of these debt for nature. It's a whole economic system rigged based around monetizing nature, and of course continuing to fleece the former colonies, many of whom are obviously declared independence in the last 100+ years and are still trying to get on their feet. This is, in my view, another way for the predator class behind the United Nations and really steering things to just maintain that control of these developing nations, many of whom don't trust the West and don't believe in this system, but are trying to use the UN to the best that they can. And they're once again waving the flag saying, hey, we're being ignored, like something's not right here.
Right. And then the point that you're making is that, doing all that while then presenting to the world as if you're the altruistic entity only fighting for the interest of the people, which it's literally the opposite, and not even listening to the people they claim they're trying to help. It's absurd. Now, I wanted to ask about in the UN point you made there. It's interesting because I think what's kind of self-evident is that these governments are very aware that they're not fighting for their interests, right? So you do think there's an element of them putting this out to sort of try to influence their opinion, like maybe they've changed, maybe they're in a different direction. Do you think that's going to have any effect? I just think that's an interesting point.
I think the UN leadership is, Antonio Guterres and others, and as I said, the people maybe who are really steering. We know Bill Gates is a massive donor to the World Health Organization. There's also similar influences in the United Nations, and not to say he's the top of the pyramid, but there are powerful people really steering things and who have agendas, as we've seen with COVID and other things. But I wouldn't say every single nation on the planet and all their leadership is 100% on board with the Summit of the Future or the World Health Organization treaty, as we're seeing now. And so that does give me a little bit of hope that so my reason for writing this as well, and for one of the reasons I'm glad we're talking about this, and I've been trying to talk to as many people as possible, is we just saw the World Health Organization treaty come to, not the conclusion they wanted, not necessarily because all the countries woke up that the vaccines are killing people or anything like that. But nonetheless, there was pushback, there was resistance. You had articles writing in the mainstream about sovereignty could potentially be ceded to the WHO. And of course, the WHO had to respond to it. And then even just in the last 24 hours, Tedros is saying we need to focus on anti-vaxxers, that they're a global threat. So there was a successful effort to raise awareness and say, hey, the WHO treaty, we all need to be paying attention to this pandemic treaty. So many people have known about that. I would love to see a similar awareness around the Pact for the Future, because this is, I believe, just as potentially, maybe even more transformative of a document if they remake the entire international global governance systems, and if all the countries sign a pact for the future. Clearly, whatever is in that document is going to impact us, the people who live in these countries that are, being used like pawns, as these people claim to have the right to decide our futures, which clearly I don't think most people here would say that they do have that right. So I just want people to really understand that we do have a moment here to maybe create pressure on the ground level. And I'm really talking about and whoever's interested, reach out to me, organizing some kind of counter thing, whether it's a protest or just a gathering at the UN on the 21st to the 23rd of September this year, to just raise awareness, at least to make it clear, like, you don't represent us. We don't, support whatever it is you guys are going to sign in there. And maybe what is June 1st right now? So June, July, August, there's 3.5, almost 4 months now to put pressure on whoever you think is worth putting pressure on. You had with the treaty, the pandemic treaty, you had U.S. politicians, senators, representatives, and even local politicians in some cases speaking out. Maybe with enough pressure, we could see a similar effort and more awareness could be raised. And when September comes, the UN can't just sneakily in the background force us and maybe other countries that don't really want to go along with it to buy into their agenda. And to do that, we need people to really understand what they're talking about. And that's why I wrote this article. And one of the other points, Ryan, I want to make about this is that there's a lot of references to planetary emergencies and declaring a planetary emergency. In fact, the zero draft of the Pact for the Future, which, as I said, was just put together late April, it includes a mention of an emergency platform that they said would be activated in the event of, quote, such a shock that it has an impact on multiple regions of the world and would require a, quote, coherent, coordinated, and multidimensional response. They claim that this emergency platform would not be a standing institution or body, and that this would, quote, fully respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states. Of course, they know they need to put that in language, but nevertheless, like, this is something we need to be paying attention to. This is all about putting the money, the resources, and the tools, just like the treaty, into place so that if they declare a planetary emergency based on whatever it's not a very specific, it just says something that impacts multiple regions of the world. That could be almost anything, right? A shock that impacts multiple regions of the world. The UN then will have the power to declare planetary emergency. Obviously, it could be related to climate change, and then initiate this emergency platform, which we don't know what that could lead to. So there are definitely some worrisome aspects of this discussion.
Well, see, what I think is what we need, which I'm sure you probably already considered, out there listening, consider whether or not this is the whole problem, reaction, solution kind of dynamic here, where it very likely could have been that the accord and the public version of what was in my opinion, almost, at a time when people were calling things just like that out, coming out with like an over the top thing that was very clearly undermining sovereignty, only to see us push back for this to subtly come out as if it's not that, even though this might have been the plan all along. Like, as you know well, that's something that happens often. And I think what you're highlighting here is a very concerning, I mean, it seems to have all the trappings of the same thing, but in a more subtle way. That might be exactly the problem here. And I think the idea you highlighted, as it says right here, the draft says the UN will commit to a vision of multilateral system that is inclusive to allow for a diverse range of actors beyond states. Like, the language in here shows you very clearly the globalist concept. And going back to the point about the climate change aspect, it says again, we'll better equip the nations to fight poverty and climate change. And so we know what that means. We know that comes back to the idea of the carbon control and the manipulation therein, which is not really honest. So all the same things are there. So in your mind, how is this different than the other one, other than the more forward language? It seems to have all the same things, right?
I think it's very similar to what we saw with the WHO Treaty and with other, I think they're going to try any kind of way they can. This is what people don't understand. Keeping up with the United Nations alone is a full-time job. The World Economic Forum, they're putting out papers every other week. They've got so many different commissions and organizations, and the COP28, they're doing annual meetings, the General Assembly, the General Meeting, like, it's a lot. And at each of those meetings and reports, there's side meetings that might come to a new commission, this, and it's just all kinds of globalist, internationalist bureaucracy that is very difficult to keep up with. And I think that they try every other way they can. Like, they're going to keep pushing forward. And in many cases, they've gotten, I would say just in general, they've gotten this far since 1992 with the Rio conference, which was really the beginning of a lot of this. It existed before, but in terms of the climate narrative, they've gotten this far because most people weren't paying attention until the last 10 years. Like, I remember 2010 when I was just getting into this stuff, Alex Jones was talking about Agenda 21. A few other people were saying that. And at that time, there was mostly people saying that's just right-wing talking points. It's just climate, it's all about helping the environment. And more people have realized, like, that's not what this is about. That this is technocracy in action. This is the way that they're going to bring it in. And this is one of the ways. Obviously, we saw they use COVID to move the ball forward. They've got people more comfortable with things like digital identities in the terms of vaccine and immunity passports. Now it's going to switch to maybe carbon credit IDs, just a digital wallet in general that can have everything you have. That's absolutely a part of this. And I think that for them to do that, they realize they have to step the game up. And so that's either UN 2.0, it's the Pact for the Future, it's declaring a planetary emergency. The WHO Treaty had everybody all worried because people saw the pandemic and or the alleged pandemic and what happened, and saw how governments wanted to take power, and they want even more. So, like you said, a lot of energy went that direction. It seems like there's not so much attention or understanding or energy paying attention to the Pact for the Future. And the Pact for the Future seems to basically be the climate change and sort of open, blank check version of what the WHO Treaty was, where the WHO Treaty was specifically focused on health and pandemics. This is more climate change and sort of broadly, like, any shock that affects multiple regions. So it's another ploy to grab more power.
Yeah, and to your point, but they as usually in my opinion, the most alarming and surreptitious are the ones that don't make it explicit. That's broad and open-ended, like you said, like that seems to apply to just any situation they deem to be important, which in their minds, a lot of these people are arguing that's right now, that we're going to die in 30 seconds if we don't fight climate change. So a lot of these people are already kind of breathlessly, like hair on fire, acting like we're in that. So if this becomes reality, I think it's something that would be initiated almost immediately. I mean, that's what worries me. And as we're focused on something that is seemingly at least being held up, which I think they recently just talked again about how the WHO Accord was kind of stalled. I mean, it almost seems like they're trying to go, look over here, it's not working, while they subtly place this thing in front of, the same thing, it's the same point. That's very concerning to me. I'm glad you're highlighting this, because even before you talked about this, is something that I hadn't even seen. So even those of us paying attention, these things are slipping by as there's so much going on in the world.
Absolutely. And there's just a couple more points I want to hit on this before we start to move forward to the next story. For one, like you said, Ryan, I think that there is a very real potential that there was some misdirection going on here. Not to say that the WHO Treaty doesn't matter at all. In fact, I think all these things matter, but we need to be able to juggle more than one thing at once and realize that the WHO treaty isn't the end all be all. They've got other plans. They've got other initiatives, and this is just one of them. One of the other points I'd like to bring up on this, I quote from this organization called the Climate Governance Commission, which is not a part of the UN. I want to make that clear just in case anybody says that I'm saying that, but they are absolutely connected through membership and through funding, and they work with the UN. They put out a report called Governing Our Planetary Emergency. This organization, and particularly the scientist named Johan Rockström, are like the main proponents of this whole planetary emergency, or what he calls the planetary boundaries, that there's different planetary boundaries, and that if we pass those, like if the water gets too contaminated, just different little measurements that he created. It's not necessarily backed by science, it's just his theory, but a lot of people are adopting it, that if we pass these certain planetary boundaries, then we've gone into planetary emergency. It's his work that a lot of this is being based on. And so his organization, or the organization he's a part of, they put out this report November 28, 2023. And in this report, I think it makes it clear what they're talking about. It says, a basic premise of the Climate Governance Commission is that new perspectives on global governance, deploying new levels of collective wisdom and political courage, are required to tackle the current existential planetary risks. And it says, by prioritizing fundamental global collective action innovations, we can protect the future, blah, blah. Now, I believe that when they say things like deploying new levels of quote unquote collective wisdom and political courage, it's an understanding, a reference that making the moves they want to make aren't going to be popular with the people. And that we've heard this before with other climate change narrative, where they said, well, it's not going to be fun, it's not going to be easy, but we're going to have to do it anyways to transition to renewable energy, or whatever they say, towards the green kind of regime. So there's this acknowledgement that politicians are going to have some courage and make some hard choices, because the people aren't going to like it. And then the other thing I'll mention, Johan Rockström, the scientist I just discussed, he spoke at this November 2023 event. They had an online conference putting out the report Governing Our Planetary Emergency. It was part of UN events going on. And he said clearly, the fact that we are in the Anthropocene, which is the idea that we're in the sixth mass extinction event, this actually puts into question the nation state as the only unit of decision making to solve the problems we have facing us. And they continue on in other documents. We therefore urge the UN at the 2024 Summit of the Future to declare a planetary emergency, recognizing the triple planetary crisis poses a grave risk to the world, et cetera, et cetera. And this is very similar to what we've already seen in the Zero Draft report, which came out in April, of the Pact for the Future. So, and the last little thing I'll mention here is that they do mention a quote in a section titled Addressing Individual Responsibility for Environmental Crimes, including ecocide as a crime, using the International Criminal Court. And they say individuals, not corporations, not governments, but individuals involved in policies and or activities that cause severe damage to the environment need to be held accountable, regardless of whether they take these actions as government officials, legislators, military leaders, CEOs of corporations, or in other roles. And generally speaking, that might be a good thing, right? Maybe that means they're going to hold the military leaders who've been dropping bombs responsible for the damage they did to the planet. I highly doubt it, but you could see how language like that could then be turned to, like, you littered this week, or you used too many carbon credits, or something, whatever they claim, and all of a sudden you're facing responsibility for environmental crime. So I think there's definitely some worrisome language in there.
Before we move past that, you bring up an interesting point that we can end on this segment is so I've talked about the Anthropocene in the past. Not necessarily that, like, I don't know how in any sense these days we pretend we proved what, science is now telling, kind of like basic things that we just regurgitate because we were taught this growing up, that we not necessarily individually prove these things. But my point being that that's like been a statement for a while now, that scientifically they're arguing we're in the Anthropocene, which is, for those that don't know, like the dinosaur extinction, that was one of these events. And this is the sixth argument that that's happening in the world's existence. And I think what's interesting about that is, I don't know whether we can argue that's necessarily the truth or that's more political, but I think we all can, anybody who's being objective, we can realize that there is a lot of damage taking place. And I know you've made the same argument. Like, it's obvious that military burn pits and what they're doing around the world, and their wars in general, or just plastic waste and microplastics, like, we're definitely hurting this planet in irreparable ways. That does not mean that we should be stopping, leaning into the climate change agenda, because I think it's clear that that's, a very politicized, if not completely illogical and wrong direction. But so what do we do in that conversation where we can see that there is a problem? Like, let's just say hypothetically, like my point about the Anthropocene, I think I wrote something about this a long time ago, is the argument that made it clear to me was that there is verifiably species that are going rapidly extinct. A lot of them are smaller, almost microscopic in the ocean, but they are seeing this, and it's kind of a rapidly escalating thing. Now, I think that's kind of easy to see, and that is obviously indicative of the fact that there's a problem. But so where do you place that, right? So I think in my mind it's being weaponized. So go ahead. Go ahead. Give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that you bring up something really important there, Ryan, because I do consider myself to be, I mean, it's not like a label I wear, but if somebody asks me, sure, I'm an environmentalist. I care about the planet. I care about the animals. And there are some measurable things that are happening to the planet. Like you said, species loss, deforestation. There are island nations that are seeing waters rise that might be underwater very soon. I can't claim to know. I know the climate change narrative says, well, it's the heat, the glaciers melting, et cetera. They've got those arguments. We can't have a discussion about climate change or the environment without discussing weather modification and geoengineering. That's a whole big thing people forget. And then, like you said, there are just the regular things. There are shitty people that throw plastic and dump trash on the ground, and like those things do exist. I believe we should find ways to address all those things, and it is a thin line to walk, like you were mentioning, without falling into a lot of the what I consider anti-human climate change narratives, right? I wrote an article years ago for the Anti-Media about this claim of the sixth mass extinction event, the Anthropocene, and just kind of saying, like, most of the people who are behind these ideas, they are people who claim that the population bomb was going to go off in the 70s and 80s, and we'd have people dead in the streets because there'd be too many people. They've been wrong so many times, and they really do have an anti-human agenda. It's eugenics agenda, and that's the last point I want to make about the Summit of the Future. But so we shouldn't fall into that trap and yes, humans are all bad, and we're just the scum on the earth, we're the virus on the planet, this sort of stuff. I think we shouldn't fall into that trap, but yes, we should encourage personal responsibility. We should take care of the planet around it. We should want clean waters, and we should want forests that our kids can go play in and camp in, and we should be spraying less pesticides. Like, there's a lot of good core environmental topics that we can all agree on that don't have to fall into the climate change narrative.
Right, and the point being, is that it's not. They're focusing as if you're driving to work every day is the problem, when the very people acting like they're going to fight this are the ones, the primary problem for why we're in this position. So, it's important.
Absolutely.
A lot of people hear what you just said and try to pluck out the points that make it sound like you're leaning into the climate change agenda. And it's very opposite. The reality is clearly that there is issues with the planet, but it's not about the game that they're playing. So we have to be able, like always, there's nuance. We have to be able to acknowledge both those things simultaneously. And since you brought it up, I'll just include this from Geopolitics and Empire, which I thought was really alarming. This is from Global Challenges. It's a kind of a Global Challenges Foundation, a globalist entity, basically saying the new globalist study says that we have to reduce the current population if everyone starts eating GMO food, stops eating meat, and only has one child. Like, this is a real thing. And the idea being that so your options are either reduce the planet. Don't forget, Bill Gates even said, if we could just get that population down, like, it's so ridiculous how on the surface this is. If you bring it up in the wrong circles, you're a conspiracy theorist. But they're literally publishing studies about how we can, do all the wrong things. I mean, GMO food has been proven to be detrimental to society. It's just kind of mind blowing that we're even in a position where people are still pushing things like this. But to your point, I think it's very.
That's a good place to segue to the last section of my article, and then we can jump to the next topic. I just put here at the end, all roads lead to the Club of Rome and eugenics, because for those who've read my work at TLAV or some of the reporting Whitney Webb's done for TLAV and for Unlimited Hangout, looking into the history of the World Economic Forum, you got Henry Kissinger, you got folks connected to the Club of Rome, which, again, like the Bilderberg Group, is much more obscure and behind the scenes. They have a public face, they put out reports, but less people know about them. And the Club of Rome first started calling for declaring a planetary emergency in 2019 with the publication of what they called the Planetary Emergency Plan. They updated this in August 2020 after COVID started, and they call it, quote, a roadmap for governments and other stakeholders to shift our societies and economies to bring back balance between people, planet, and prosperity. And pretty much the zero draft of the Pact of the Future, which again will be signed if everything goes their way in September, and that other report from the Climate Governance Commission, both of those echo the same language that came from the Club of Rome originally. And again, the Club of Rome is largely responsible for pushing the climate change narrative. They started in 1968. Then they were part of the 1973 World Economic Forum, the early meetings. And the World Economic Forum actually had one of the co-founders there, Alexander King. He was one of the authors of the infamous book, Limits to Growth, where they started talking about much what you were just saying there, Ryan, like that Global Challenges Foundation is pretty much mirroring what they were writing back in the 70s and 90s. And Alexander King wrote another report in 91 titled The First Global Revolution, where they have a section that's called The Common Enemy of Humanity is Man. And I'll just read this section. And I want to say before I read it, the Club of Rome, of course, has responded and said, this is all being taken out of context. This is just us acknowledging that humanity is facing problems. But many people look at this and say, look, this is the moment where they realize like we need to make it. And this is 1 year, of course, before 1992, Rio, Brazil, UN big environmental conference. This is where they said we need to make it that humanity is the problem. It says, quote, in searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and in their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which demands the solidarity of all peoples. But in designating them as the enemy, we fall into the trap about which we have already warned, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself.
Yeah, hard to misunderstand that. It's pretty exact, and this is something I think is important. People, if look into that exact starting point from there, I think it all becomes very clear. So I'm really glad that you wrote this, and this is important. So make sure, keep us up on this. Let us know what's going on. I think this is something you've really been continuing to highlight, and people find it very valuable. So thank you for that. On that
one last thing, Ryan, before we jump, I had one more. I'll remember one more thing. Sorry to jump in there, but just in the terms of solutions, for those who are interested, just like in 2020, myself and John Bush and some friends, we launched the Greater Reset as a response to the World Economic Forum Great Reset. And for the last 4 years, we've been having annual meetings in January in Mexico and Texas, just 5 days, just like Davos does, but focused on solutions from the bottom up. And it's been very successful. We reached thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people around the world, dozens of countries coming in person. It's been amazing. At this year's event, we sort of relaunched, and we're now calling it the People's Reset. And at that event, shortly after that, one of the gentlemen who came down to speak is Dan Aston Gregory. He's a great activist over in the UK. He's actually at the rally in Geneva right now. And we just announced the People's Reset UK. And the reason I mentioned that is this time, this is sort of a response to the Summit for the Future. We're calling it the People's Reset, our summit for our future. And it's happening the weekend after the UN is meeting in New York City. We'll be in the UK. So, just mentioning it's going to be free online for everybody to watch again. But if you happen to be in Europe or the UK and you want to connect, this is just another way. I think that it's important for us to raise awareness like we're doing here, but also when the opportunity provides to counter these narratives, and to push back. Okay, they want to have a summit where they say, or they want to have a pandemic treaty and meet in UN. Well, now people are out there rallying in Geneva today saying, no, we declare our own sovereignty. We're not part of that. We did the same thing with the Great Reset. So this September, we're kind of doing a similar thing. All right, you have your summit of the future. We're going to do our own thing. And, if you want to learn more about that, you can go to thegreaterreset.org.
Outstanding. Yeah, I think that's very important because there are other paths to be taken than the one thing they want you to do for their benefit. And so on that overlap with, the political conversation, you were recently at the Libertarian Convention and, were able to briefly talk with RFK Jr. and kind of see a lot of different overlaps in the political, the interesting overlap in my eyes of the Libertarian Convention and yet seemingly kind of being directed towards the two-party illusion. So tell me what you saw there, what you found important, and we have those clips ready when you'd like to play them, one with Massey and Shipton.
Cool. Yeah. So I've never been a member of the Libertarian Party. I've been a part of the broader liberty freedom movement, I guess you could say, since 2010. I was very inspired early on by the work of Ron Paul when he ran in 2008, 2012. I never voted for him or played the whole game, ran as a delegate or any of that kind of stuff. I just sort of watched from a distance with interest. I read his book, Revolution Manifesto. Clearly, he was a huge influence on a lot of people. Some of those people went to the Libertarian Party. Some of them became anarchists, voluntarists. Some of them decided to like, okay, I'm going to try to push libertarianism through the Republican Party like he tried. A lot of different paths, different ways. But the people inspired by him are definitely in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people now at this point. So we're more than a decade past his last presidential run. And a lot of those same people now are involved in the Libertarian Party. Some of them were involved in what's called the Mises Caucus, and they took over the party 2 years ago. And so there's been a lot of talk around mainstream media about that, claiming that the Mises Caucus and the takeover was like a MAGA operation, and these people are far right. And a lot of it, I would say, is garbage. Definitely some people who I don't align with, who are part of that movement and have differing opinions that I don't think are libertarian. But the point is, going into this convention, they had a lot of attention, more than the party's ever received in its 50-year history. The Libertarian Party was started in 1971 by a bunch of activists who were part of the 60s Vietnam War protests and a lot of those different things. Some of them thought a political party was the answer. Others thought it was a mistake from the beginning. And in the last 50 years, the best they've done is get 3% of the vote with Gary Johnson, former governor of former governor of New Mexico, and usually 1% of the vote less, things like that. That's what they're used to. But this year they've been getting a lot more attention because of the Mises Caucus, and particularly because they invited Donald Trump to come speak. They also invited Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to come speak. That is a precedent-setting thing on its own, just because no other political party has ever done that. You wouldn't see the Democrats inviting the Republican nominee to come speak at their convention, right? It's kind of weird in a way. And there was actually a lot of libertarians who were offended and bothered by it, particularly their presidential candidates, who are saying, hey, we're here to nominate our own presidential candidate, and you're inviting 2 other candidates to come speak, and there's no debate, there's no interaction. We're basically just letting them come ask for votes and then leave. So there was a lot of just discussion going into it about whether this was the right move, the wrong move. I came as a journalist and as a libertarian, as a voluntarist who's interested in what happens, but again, not a member of the party. And I did get a chance to talk to Kentucky Representative Thomas Massie and to Gabriel Shipton, who's Julian Assange's brother. I also was there for Donald Trump's speech. We can talk about that if you want. I was there for Robert F. Kennedy's speech, and I interviewed a bunch of different libertarians kind of off camera, just getting the feeling for what people thought about it. And overall, I would say that, my thoughts are that the political system is still just a waste of time. I mean, I just bless the people who are trying to go through the third parties and do something a little bit more principled. But at the end of the day, what I saw, day one, it was already being reported in mainstream press, like that there was fistfights among the libertarians trying to get their votes together. Just the whole process of, okay, our state wants this and our state wants this, and then the screaming and the yelling. I was just like, wow, and this is supposed to be better than the Republicans or Democrats, right? It just not satisfactory to me. I think there's a lot of people, again, who have good intentions and who want something to do, and they're still believing in the system, and they're not ready to give up, but they know they don't trust the left, they don't trust the right. And I would say the same thing applies to the Kennedy people, good people who are trying to do something. But I don't think, with all the corruption we know and everything we just talked about, the summit of the future and the long-term plan, politics is not going to lead to stopping these things. I'm not saying politicians occasionally don't say good things. Thomas Massie is one of the best people I think that's in there doing some good things. But I just don't see any real hope coming out of that. And I think there was a lot of disenchanted people. Unfortunately, it seems like, and I've witnessed this before, people who claim to be libertarian, but then will support the Republican candidate because, well, I guess principles don't matter if you don't think you're going to win. And another thing I think some folks misunderstand about the liberty movement broader, which you should understand, the Libertarian Party is just a tiny bit of a broader freedom movement that most people aren't involved in that. Those folks are focused on politics, the greater reset, the people's reset, things like that. We're talking about libertarianism, essentially voluntarism, but we're not talking about bringing it in through politics. I think that there are good people trying to make change within there, but they're still caught in the same cycle. And some of those people may claim to be libertarian, but if it's not, if they don't think they're going to win, there's that human psychology. People want to be a part of a winning team. So it's like Trump even mocked that during his speech. He said, what I think you should do is nominate me or vote for me. Everybody started booing, boo. And he said, well, unless you want to just get your 1%, 2%. And I think some people, they really took that to heart, and they're like, no, I want to be a part of a winning team. So even if that means I'll vote for somebody who doesn't align with my principles, I want to win. Whereas others, I heard specifically say, you know what, he can make fun of us all we want, but I'd rather get 1% and still have my principles and stick to that, right? So you have these kind of differing views. And I know I said a lot, but before we get to the videos, you can share whatever you're thinking on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what's interesting to add to your point is that I think I would always argue, and I think you agree with this, is that it's not necessarily that this system or a system is not capable of having something honest, but rather, and it maybe that's the case, but I don't think that's a verifiable idea. I think that we just are in a system where it is corrupted to a degree that there's no using this forward. There's no fixing what we're dealing with right now with this system. And I think that's just, I mean, I think it's actually self-evident from both sides, but only when they look at the other side, right? Like it's like this interesting dynamic where they can argue that it's broken, but that side's the problem. And the reality being that, if we keep trying to work it in the system, we're all going to end up with the same result. But I still argue that it would be possible to create a system, whether like this or something different, that obviously could be honest. And I think that's important. My point in saying that is to not like people out there that still think like, it's not just that we're going, this doesn't work, screw it, and there's no answer to it, right? We're simply highlighting that this is a hamster wheel and we're stuck in this, right? And we need to look in a different direction. At least I am. And I think that I want to ask you a couple points about this. So do you feel that what you're looking at now is a co-opted concept? Like, because this is always how this goes, where we see the Green Party or whatever else, and whether they were ever honest to begin with, the argument becomes that they are very clearly now, Green Party, co-opted by corporations, and, seeing that it goes the opposite direction. Do you think there's an element to that happening here, first and foremost? Do you think that's part of it?
Do you mean with the LP?
Yeah, with the Libertarian Party. Like, do you think that this is something that has now been co-opted by the same?
I do. And I can't say at what level, because just full disclosure, I'm good friends with the guy, Michael Heiss, who founded the Mises Caucus and who helped take over. I actually did interview him. That's on my website as well, if people want to find that. And I asked him directly, like, even though we're old friends, like, hey, Mike, there's pictures of you with Patrick Byrne, who is the Overstock CEO guy, and he was deeply tied to the Trump campaign. And there's, conspiracy theories online. I call them conspiracy theories because they truly are just theories at this moment. There's no hard evidence. But I did my research and I asked them, I said, there are people definitely claiming that you and Angela McArdle, the chair of the LP, who came with the takeover, who won her position and kept her position this year, that y'all have some deep ties or some ties, some tangential ties or other to the Trump camp, and that you may really be trying to push people towards that direction. They claim, and Michael told me that, really in his eyes, this is just the Ron Paul revolution, people coming back and now taking over the LP and trying to keep it about the actual libertarian message. There's division. They chose a candidate this year who a lot of people are unhappy with, and who's got some, I think, incorrect views on transgender practices and stuff like that. Technically, sure, he's a libertarian, but I think he's got some wrong opinions that a lot of people don't like. So if it was a total takeover, then I think the Mises Caucus not only would have got the chair, they would have got their presidential candidate, and they didn't. So maybe there's, they can't completely control everything, but without a doubt, with any centralized organization, which is what a political party is, you got delegates and members spread around the country, but ultimately you got a chair and you got people who can be bought off. I'm not saying Angela McArdle's bought off. I have no evidence that. I'm just saying individuals can be bought off. They can be influenced. So if an individual at the top with a lot of power is the spokesman and is speaking for the party, and for example in this case is literally tweeting out, she has her personal opinion and she's saying that, like, hey, libertarians, the ball's in your court, so get your stuff together if you actually want to get a libertarian in the cabinet, which is what Trump promised, if you actually want to free Ross Ulbricht, which is what Trump promised. So there are libertarians who are falling for these promises from Trump and saying, and again, this is a weird thing, imagine like the Democratic chair not backing up the candidate, in this case Biden, whether or not they privately like them or not. Typically, if you're going to play the political game, you unite behind your candidate. In this case, you have the LP chair telling people to support Trump, because if Trump wins, then they're going to get libertarians in the cabinet and get all these promises. And so I don't know, does that mean she's controlled or bought off? I don't have the evidence for that, but it sure is a weird thing to see.
It is. And so on that same note then, and just what's your opinion about, do you think that it's incorrect, like ideologically incorrect or inconsistent, for a libertarian to vote for something other than a libertarian? Like, I mean, to your point, if you're a Republican and you vote for a Democrat, that's obviously something that anybody has the right to do, but it would be seen as sort of, at least in the current political dynamic, that you're challenging or like breaking from your party. So in your mind, is it, since it's a third party and seemingly not with a lot of influence in the context of 3%, that is it normal, or is that seen as a challenge to their beliefs? Like, do you think that's a overlap to vote for somebody?
I think Trump, I think Trump has just messed up the game and messed up people's heads. Like, okay, so if you're a libertarian, whether you're an anarchist libertarian who doesn't vote, or you're a member of the Libertarian Party who, begrudgingly votes because you don't really trust the system, but you want to do something, right? And you're like, I'm going to vote. I'm definitely not voting Biden or Trump. I want to support the libertarian candidate. And then they came and they choose the candidate, and you're like, you know what? That candidate isn't really the kind of libertarian that I want representing me. I think a principled person would then choose to abstain and not vote before going and totally compromising themselves and voting for Trump or Biden or RFK or anybody else. Because from a libertarian perspective, just saying again, from a purely libertarian principle perspective, which is about individual liberties, self-ownership, private property rights, these kind of core things to that philosophy, those other people are not aligned with that. So if you really are consistent in your values, and I would say the same thing, like if you're a consistent Republican, then you wouldn't vote Biden, right? If you're consistent conservative, whatever, progressive, then you're not going to vote Trump, right? So at the very least, if you're going to be participating, I think you should vote your conscience always, whether that means you're voting with a party that has your name in it or you choose not to vote. I think that's really what it comes down to. And for me, when I first started getting into this stuff, man, like that's what attracted me to libertarianism. Again, I'd never been involved in the party, but it felt like this is actually something that sticks to its principles and is about these values. Even whenever people are like, no, we got to compromise. No, we need to be pragmatic. No, we need to do these things. You're willing to say like, I'm not going to do that because doing so is against individual liberty. Even if I think in the long term, I'm going to get some sort of, some little carrot or something that they're promising me, which is all Trump is doing, is dangling a carrot in front of the libertarians and saying, support me and I'll put one of you in my cabinet, as if that's going to fix everything.
Right. I mean, and this is why I've said so often, in my opinion, the word compromise, and when it comes to politics, is a dirty word, right? I mean, you're talking about this idea where you're compromising what you believe in because you think that, even if you think, like legitimately think, and even if it's true, that it will end up benefiting in some way what you want to happen. I mean, you're choosing, like, I agree with you completely. I don't know why you wouldn't still vote for the person that you believe in hopes that, like, especially when it comes to before you've seen the outcome. I mean, look at how ridiculous it is that we can have the crazy and completely illegitimate polls that said that Clinton's going to win in a landslide. And then it's the exact opposite, right? The idea that you don't truly know what the outcome will be, regardless of what percentages they're showing you. And they choose to then vote else in another direction before they even see what the outcome is, based on that assumption that they're not going to win. Like, that's a game in and of itself, And so I think it's important that what you highlighted, I make this point every year, that abstention is something that they've stolen from you, right? That the idea is that there should be a box on every ballot to be, I abstain. Like, that's an actual legitimate vote, not participating. That's also something you have the right to do, but saying I abstain out of protest, or I don't think these candidates are, that's such a,
it sends a message.
I pointed out, like, jury nullification. It's something they just don't want you to know exists for obvious reasons. I think that's very important.
Well, even in the Libertarian Party, it's part of the libertarian rules, and this is something I do appreciate, that all votes must include what they call nota, none of the above. And so, and this was another sort of controversial part. Whenever they chose their candidate, 30% of people said none of the above. So it was either like some write-ins or Chase Oliver. And to the other people who were like, hey, that's 30% of the people basically voting to abolish the party, because if they didn't nominate anybody, then they would lose federal funding, like as a party. And that's one thing that the Libertarian Party, this is why they even have relevance, is because over the last 50 years, they've worked hard to get chapters in all 50 states and to have libertarianism is on the ballot. Like, it's on the ballot. That's why Trump came there, because he knows that they can have an influence. And if they didn't choose a candidate, they could potentially lose that. So I think that's one thing that you could have in the mainstream system, none of the above, something like that everybody could, like, imagine that if the polls showed 20% went to Trump, 20% went to Biden, 10% went to RFK, and some 50-60% goes to none of the above, like, that definitely would send a message. And as far as these clips, I'll just tell everybody, like, check them out at theconsciousresistance.com. I know we're short on time, and I definitely want to get into some of these other stories, but I did interview Thomas Massie and Gabriel Shipton, and as I mentioned, Michael Heiss of the Mises Caucus at the Libertarian Convention. And I also recorded some of Trump's speech. You can find that on some of my channels and at theconsciousresistance.com.
None of these you want to check out? I mean, some of these are pretty short if you want to listen to one of them.
Yeah. So this was actually just a couple days. The Massey one, I did try to talk to RFK at the LNC, but he went and talked to Tim Pool instead. But just a couple of days ago in Texas, I went to this Bitcoin conference called Consensus, only because I knew he was going to be there. And this is the interaction I had with him.
You are here speaking to the crypto audience. Last week, the Libertarians, you're reaching out to people who are not vibing with the two-party system, especially younger people. I'm 39, so folks like myself, 40 and under, let's say, who are really concerned about the two-party system. And you offer a different message, but one area where you align with the two other guys is on the support for Zionism and Israel. Do you have anything to say to those supporters who might be who want to support you but are concerned about that?
They're fighting a defense.
Do you still think the Palestinians are the most pampered people in the world?
I think the Palestinians have received more money than any other group in the world from the international aid agencies. Approximately $8,600 per person. After World War II, we rebuilt Europe and the expenditure was about $626 per person. So Palestinians receive more than 10 times that. I'm very pro-Palestinian. I want them to receive that money. But the question is, why is Palestine now not one of the richest countries in the Mideast? The reason for that is because leadership has stolen that money. The top, Ismail Haniyeh, who runs Hamas, has got a net worth of $4 billion. The other leaders of Hamas are billionaires or 100 millionaires. And they've used that money to make war, to build an underground city, 300 miles of tunnels. They're not using it to benefit the Palestinian people. Palestinian people ought to be pampered, but they weren't. They're starved, but not by Israel, by their own leaders.
Any comment on the Sunday bombing?
No, thank you.
The bombing on Sunday, Bobby?
That's it.
That's it. Quickly check this out. Look at her face when she walks out. I didn't catch this last time.
So Palestinians receive.
See that right there? Oh, he got through. That's just hilarious.
Dude, I think you saw me comment on Twitter, but the reason she made that face is because only 2 minutes before this, after he did a press conference where we all got one question and I chose to ask about Ross Ulbricht, I came up to her afterward and said, "Hi, Stephanie, it's Derrick." Because I've been, this, Ryan, I've been talking to her for 2 years now. Even before he ran for president, I've been trying to get an interview with him. She became press secretary. She's from Eco Health or Eco Defense or something, a climate change organization. And I went up to her and she basically told me that, which is fine, it's whatever, freedom, do what you want. But she pretty much told me that I don't have a national enough audience for them to do interviews. So she just because I kept saying like, I'll wait. I've emailed you again. I texted you. I had to struggle to even get into this thing before they would let me in. And so she just pretty much brushed me off and said, "Yeah, we're just focused on national audiences." I said, "All right, well, thank you." And then I walked out of the room and I just happened to walk out and I could see his security kind of standing at every corner. And I just sort of subtly sat down at a chair nearby. And then he came out of the bathroom. So I knew something was going on. As soon as he came out of the bathroom, I turned on my camera and that's what you see. So she must have gone back around the other side, came through the thing, and it's, oh my God, here he is. So I'm definitely not getting a bigger interview than this at any point, but it was worth it because this is a question I've wanted to ask him for some time. Yeah, and his answer is garbage.
It is. There's so many points you could make about this, but we won't get into all of it. But, the idea that the leadership he highlights are verifiably funded by Israel in more than one circumstance. And in my opinion, I think I've pretty much proven that they're comfortably sitting in Qatar where Israel allows that to continue. And on the record, by the way, even stated more than once that they won't go after them in Qatar. It's an absurd dynamic. Or the idea that I literally just showed that even right now, the aid that they're either not putting through or the stuff that does get through, despite what Israel's doing, is being there's evidence already of IDF members using that aid on record, posting it on their Instagrams, going, "Thanks for the aid." That's part of what happens too. It's so infuriating. Or whether these information numbers are even accurate based on what Israel puts out.
I don't think they are.
I don't either.
I think I should probably do an article trying to, I don't want to say debunk because I don't know. I haven't looked into it. I've just heard him say this a couple times, but to fact check that statement, I already started looking at it while we were playing the video and I don't think it's accurate. So maybe that'll be an upcoming article because he's going to keep using that statement that, they're getting all this aid and this and that. Like you were alluding to, there's already some holes in that story.
100%. Well, I wanted to actually say as well before we move past the libertarian point, did you want to play Massey as well? Or do you want to just go to the other articles?
If you want to play Massey, it's not too long.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say that I think it's important that, if you're libertarian out there and based on what we're talking about, and you plan on voting, imagine what would happen if, again, assuming that your vote actually translates the outcome, which I don't think, but if you believe that, Imagine if you all just stood your ground and there's a huge, the whole conversation of how many people literally don't participate in the election. And a lot of them, as you're highlighting, are libertarians that don't believe that's going to be possible. Imagine if they all just decided, regardless of the narratives and the 3%, they just stood their ground and kept doing so, because there is momentum here. The fact that they're on the ballot, I mean, that's a big deal. I just think that's important to think about. And if it was consistent year after year, election after election, it would grow and it would change, but they're getting
absolutely. I mean, they're supposed to be called the principle. They call themselves the principle of party, right? So stand by the principles. Don't, this is the whole thing, is like, if you sell out whenever it's easy or whenever there's a crisis, then your principles don't really matter. Principles matter whenever times are hard.
Exactly. And so here's your discussion with Massey, and you titled it on APAC, Federal Reserve, and CBDCs.
What's interesting is over $300,000 of that money was statewide outside of my congressional district. In fact, those ads are still running. My race ended Tuesday, and APAC is still running ads against me statewide, which is political malpractice, political campaign malpractice, because it's going to elevate my name ID, and 2 years from now, nobody's going to remember what the ads were about. What's more is a super PAC associated with Senator Rand Paul has matched APAC penny for penny statewide on their ads. So Protect Freedom PAC is running positive ads for me statewide. The net result is, outside of my congressional district, even though any race statewide would be at least 2 years from now, there's been $650,000 of spending elevating my name ID statewide. So thank you, APAC.
You co-sponsored the Federal Reserve Board Abolition Act. Can you talk about the importance of bringing that issue back, which most people, especially here at the Libertarian Convention, learned about through Ron Paul?
Yeah, I joke that it's like the McRib, it's coming back, whether you like it or not. And the last time it was introduced was by Paul Brown. There were only two co-sponsors, myself and Ted Yoho. And I'm the only remaining member of Congress who sponsored it when Ron Paul was in the House of Representatives. What's fascinating to me is that 10 years ago, we got three co-sponsors on this bill. Spent 2 years getting co-sponsors and got three. This time, right, coincident with the introduction of the bill, I have 24 co-sponsors. So what's happened since Ron Paul introduced the bill, last introduced the bill 10 years ago, and now? Well, you've seen an erosion of trust in institutions. We all know FBI, CDC, FDA, these institutions, DOJ, institutions which used to have a level of trust, probably misplaced trust, but some level of trust among Americans has been eroded from the things that we've learned. And so also the things that Ron Paul were predicting have come true. We've got massive inflation. Just in 4 years, we've seen 25% of the dollar evaporate. That's all enabled by the Federal Reserve. Yes, Congress is to blame as well, but we couldn't get away with that. We couldn't have monetized our debt during COVID without the Federal Reserve. And so that's why the time has come to reintroduce that, and I think that's why we see 10 times as much support in Congress for the bill to abolish the Federal Reserve.
Just a quick follow-up on that related issue, the concern about central bank digital currencies. Obviously, you're raising awareness on this concern, and there are, the public worried about programmable money and how they might be, just used against them in certain ways for their beliefs. What are your thoughts on how the people, obviously you're fighting from within the system, what the people on the street level who are worried about this can do to raise awareness or to push back?
There will be attempts to legalize central bank digital currency in Congress, and some of these are going to be sneak attacks. We've got to remain vigilant to make sure they don't slip these into other bills. The Fed can't yet do a full-blown central bank digital currency without some kind of authorization from Congress. Even they acknowledge that. But they're doing some test runs for it, and you're seeing some pushback at state level against these test runs. But given what I've observed from government, they're probably more likely to use the big banks that they've enriched as sort of the central bank digital currency enablers and enactors. And so we've got to be vigilant there as well.
All right, thank you.
It's interesting. I was just talking about Massey the other day, and I don't think I'm ever, for the rest of my life, unless there's something monumental that happens, that I'm ever going to trust a politician again. I just don't think that's in my lifetime. But I find it hard not to, a lot most of what he says and does and votes for, I agree with. But I've seen some I pointed out that I would argue are wrong, and that's the whole compromise of politics, that even people like that would argue sometimes it's necessary to get something else done. But, you know, of all the people that speak out about this, I feel like he's taking some pretty positive stances that we should support either way.
Yeah, he seems legit. Whenever I met him, I actually gave him a copy of my book and was telling him about it. And he was like, you know, I already have my own, I generate my own electricity. He's got like solar grids. He actually put out a mini documentary or a short film about his life, I think just called Off Grid, a couple years ago, that shows his homestead and like how much he's growing food and just doing all kinds of stuff. So I definitely think, yeah, he's a politician. He's in the system, but probably the closest person allied to the things that we care about.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's finish with talking about some of the recent articles you have, in particular, a part one of a series you're putting out around Bethany Christian Services. But first, just before we go into that, I wanted to show people, in case you haven't seen it, where you can access this stuff on the website. So here's the front page, The Last American Vagabond. Under TLAV Team, you can find all these breakdown tabs where each individual, Whitney Webb, Derrick Broze, Robert Inlakesh, Tara Black, Matt Arrett, where you can see their different series. Now, Derrick has a lot of great series, and this one will eventually be one on there as well. So just make sure you guys can see that, or directly just going to the tab that is, I'll do it from right here so you guys can see it, just the Derrick tab, if you want to just keep that link somewhere that'll be updated. You know, anything that Derrick writes ends up on this page itself. So you've recently written about a couple of different things that are important, but let's talk about first the part one of Bethany Christian Services, entitled A Christian Adoption Firm with Accusations of Manipulation, Negligence, and Trafficking. So tell us about this.
Yeah, so Ryan, this is another one that came about directly from listeners and viewers who have actually, this is one of a couple of different stories that people are trying to get me to focus on. It took me a little while to get to it just because there's so much going on in the world, but I do think it's one of these stories that are not headline breaking. It's not about Donald Trump. It's not about Jeffrey Epstein. It's not about the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, but absolutely important and absolutely, I think, a vital topic to know about, because at the end of the day, it involves human beings being impacted and children being impacted, and another element of our corrupted system. I've in the past done reporting about the CPS, Child Protective Services, that I think many people know there's problems within those institutions. There's a whole multi-billion-dollar industry around adoption, around foster care, and it's not always the happy picture that we might be sold on, you know, TV commercials, or that you might see in ads on the internet or things like that about, you know, a child with a parent who just voluntarily gives them up, and a happy family who can't have babies receive the kid, and everybody's happily after. That is the case in some situations. It is also the case that sometimes parents are maybe on drugs or other, just, you know, having a criminal life or whatever, and aren't in a position to take care of a child, and they have to give up a child, and the child's life is improved. Absolutely. I want to preface by saying that surely there are some times when things work out. There are also times, as I've been learning first through this first source that reached out to me, and then in these coming articles, you'll get to learn about some other sources who are now willing to speak up for the first time, that Bethany Christian Services, and we're focused on them right now because this is what I've been learning through these sources, but I think it's a symptom of a larger problem. But Bethany Christian Services, again, calls themselves Christian firm. They are focused on encouraging mothers to not have abortions. So part of their thing is to counsel women, or they call it counseling services. They have partnerships with certain hospitals. So let's say you're a young mother, 14, 15, 16, something under than 18 years old, and you find out you're pregnant, and you express that you're not interested in having the baby, or you're incapable, or maybe even if you don't express that, they will give you a pamphlet, and it says, you know, looking for help, you know, call this number and you can get some counseling, and we can show you about what your options are. That typically leads them to an organization like Bethany Christian Services, where then these counselors, which, as I've been told, aren't necessarily licensed counselors, these are just counselors, as they're being called, from Bethany Christian Services, will come in and say, here's your options, you know. And of course, as a Christian organization, and whatever your opinions on abortion, let's set that aside for the moment if we can. As a Christian organization, they're about discouraging abortion, so that their goal is to try to keep the baby alive and to encourage the moms to adopt, and so they can get the babies into what they consider to be good Christian homes, right? So it might sound like a good deal, especially if you are a Christian or somebody who's against abortion. Like, this is a better case scenario than the baby, you know, not even coming into the world. that's debatable. Again, let's set that aside for now. What I do know is that many times the mothers-to-be are not only being approached by Bethany Christian Services without parental consent, without parents around, they're being encouraged to sign away their parental rights, to give up these babies, many times, again, underage, without parental consent, where they are already dealing with traumatic situations of being a young mother, maybe not having family support, being confused, scared, etc. And they will sign away their parental rights, be encouraged to do so as part of what they call an open adoption. And Bethany will tell them, as part of this open adoption, you're going to have access to your kid. There'll be weekly or monthly visits. You'll get to write letters. They'll send you pictures. The adoptive parents are going to, do all these things. It's going to be open up. And sometimes they say for up to 6 months, up to a year. And then after that, it's up to the parents to decide what they want to do. So they make it sound like it's going to be an amazing thing. You're going to have support the whole way. You'll have counselors. But what I've been being told by mothers and families who've worked with Bethany directly is that these promises are often not kept. And as I mentioned many times, that these mothers, who are now the ones I've spoken to, older, in their 20s, 30s, and above, looking back, realize they were taken advantage of. And, they feel like, not necessarily that they wish they would have had an abortion per se, but they feel like, if I would have known the situation, I would have kept my baby. I didn't realize I was signing away my parental rights. As I write about in this article, I actually found an example of a mother. I think she was in Michigan, where Bethany Christian Services is based in, and everything I just described, young mother, she's like, I can't have this baby. My parents are going to freak out. Bethany Christian Services counsels her to sign over her parental rights. Within a couple of days, she goes home and she tells her mom. Her mom's like, we could have taken care of the baby. What's going on? And she decides to change her mind. And luckily, in her case, there was a 28-day kind of, period, a probationary period. And she was able to get her baby back. But still, even within that, Bethany resisted and fought, and the adoptive parents to be countersued and try to prevent her from getting her baby. It's just this whole situation that I think is just another area that people aren't paying attention to. And as we know, in these areas, when we're not paying attention, corruption thrives. And just to kind of make it a little bit more relevant, we can get into some more details, but I was just sent this article by one of my sources. This is published at In These Times, and it's called "Adoption is Not a Solution to Broken Abortion Law." And this is written by a journalist that I'm actually going to be interviewing very soon. Her name's Catherine Joyce, and she wrote a book. It's called The Baby Catchers. That's all about this whole industry and how many of these industries that, again, are making billions of dollars, sometimes up to $70,000 to $100,000 per baby that they sell to different families. And they often hide it under this. I'm choosing the word hide because I don't know if you can call what they're doing Christian, but hiding it under the veneer of Christianity and religion and stuff like that. And so in this article, Catherine's just talking about that. She says, quote, "An underlying factor for all the adoptions in my study is that most mothers that I interviewed didn't want to be relinquishing their rights in the first place." And there's just, I think it's just a hugely problematic situation. The reason she actually wrote that article is because just in the last couple of years, you had Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, in one of his opinions, basically calling for making adoption the better alternative, which, again, I know people could argue it's a better alternative to abortion, but that alone isn't the end of the conversation. Just saying, okay, well, at least they didn't get aborted, they're being adopted, doesn't mean that everything is above par, right? As I talk about in my article too, there are instances where children are taken from often Eastern European countries. It's sometimes Black and brown countries, let's just say the developing nations, again, African nations, maybe South America. And those parents might be living middle-class lifestyles in their own home country. Now, that might not necessarily translate to a middle-class American lifestyle, but by all intents and purposes, the family is taken care of. The kids have family, and if their main parent's not there, they've got a distant uncle, or they've got somebody there. Bethany, through their resources, will go find these children. And sometimes there have been examples where they straight up lied to the families and said, we're going to send your child abroad. They're going to get access to the United States, and they're going to, be able to come back and see you, and it'll be better for your family. And then the parents never see the kids again. The adoptive parents in the United States, they're told, of course, this baby's parents are dead. They died in some kind of accident, or they were drug dealers, or, just whatever horror story, and like you're improving their life. So you've got lies to the adoptive parents, which may well be just good people who can't have a baby or choose to adopt and are just trusting Bethany. You've got parents being lied to in other countries in some situations, and the children, of course, having really no idea what's going on, and billions of dollars being made off this process. And so I've spoke to now several different parents who have been in this situation, some who have tried to sue Bethany and who've been countersued by Bethany and now are afraid to come out and speak publicly. And I talk about some of the other lawsuits in my article there. And there's a whole thing that, I hope people will go read the first piece, because as you mentioned, there's going to be a new one. But this connects to former Trump Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, because her whole family, the DeVos Foundation, they're huge contributors. They're, of course, they consider themselves evangelical Christians, so they're contributors to Bethany Christian Services. And I just think there's an interesting tie in there, because her brother, Eric Prince, is, of course, the private founder of what used to be known as Blackwater, now Academy, private mercenary firm. And Eric Prince and others have often said that some of the work they do, they framed it in like apocalyptic Christian terms. Like, he believes the work he's doing in the Middle East is like part of bringing, being a Christian warrior and stuff like that. So again, this is not an attack on Christians or anything like that. I'm just saying there's definitely, that's an element of what we're dealing with here, the whole religious front or veneer. And it, unfortunately, once you get into it, you find parents who are disconnected from their children. You find children who are dealing with trauma because of the whole situation. Once they come to realize, wait, my parents didn't give me up. My parents didn't want to give me up, or they felt like they were tricked, or my parents aren't really dead like I've been told my whole life. Like it's a very messy situation, and one that I've only just begun to dive into with this article, and then the next one that I'll be releasing this coming week.
And you cite a couple examples, one very clear one in this article where it ended up being, they won in the side of the original parents, which ultimately sees that even the court ruled in their favor, that they were lied to, like egregiously, and even that they fought tooth and nail to hold that up. And what I think is interesting about that is the Christian overlap. And again, I would agree with you. I would argue that a lot of the things that we can prove have happened are not Christian in any way. And I think what you can argue is that it becomes, the mindset is that it's better, even using dishonesty, to take it away from what we think are unfit parents, to put it in the hands of a Christian parent. And even if you agree with that, the idea that you're using dishonest tactics, and it's sort of like the voting greater good mindset. It's like, these are bad. It's a dishonest tactic, and it's taking you away from what you actually believe in. And I'm curious about what you think on this. And one of the actual examples you make in there is about like the LGBTQ overlap, whatever you think about that. Like, there's these interesting actions being taken that are really, just dishonest, I think is important. Do you think that there's a level of, or a possibility of like kickbacks happening from within the hospital? Because I think it's one of the most egregious aspects of this is the idea that you have hospitals or people speaking to underage children about this, making them sign things before there's even a parent there. How in the world is that even remotely considered legal? And so do you think there's a level of kickback happening there?
Absolutely. I can't prove it yet, but that's one of the things I'm looking into, because when I just had a phone call yesterday with a source who hopefully will be coming forward very soon. And she was telling me her story, and same thing. Like, she's a young girl. She's in the hospital. They show her a pamphlet of Bethany Christian Services. Eventually the counselor comes. The parents don't want anything to do with this. So she's totally, underage, just being communicated to about this. And there has to be, I'm guessing that certain hospitals or hospital systems have contracts with Bethany Christian Services and similar groups that when they are made aware that a young girl comes in and doesn't seem like she's certain if she wants to have the baby, they connect them to Bethany Christian Services. There's got to be contracts or something for that. Bethany Christians, unless they're just hanging out at the hospitals, just waiting for people to show up, there has to be some sort of system. And to that point as well, I don't think I mentioned this in the article, but there's just, as I learned more about Bethany Christian Services, which for one, there is information on there about them, but they're not a household name that most people have heard of it. I think they've done, because they like to sue, they've done a pretty good job, I think, of keeping most people quiet and afraid of speaking out. But there was some reporting I found about how they were using data mining, using cell phones to specifically do targeted ads, so that, let's say you're maybe a potential mother and you start searching abortion, or you visit an abortion clinic. They were using, I can't remember what the technology was, but basically, geolocation, to target ads to people who showed up at the abortion clinics, and to immediately get them into, considering abortion, consider adoption instead. And it's a Bethany Christian Services, which again, you could argue, hey, that's a better option. But the point is, they're invading people's privacy using this information. People have no idea that, all of a sudden they're getting this thing. And then in many cases, they end up having an unsatisfactory experience with Bethany anyways.
But again, that middle point right there is, I think, the most problematic. Is that, and this is what we see in every angle of our society today, in the politics, is that you end up like you rationalize what you think is the right outcome, and then overlook the little muddy, dangerous, illegal, or dishonest acts to get there. You know, like they're like, maybe we're violating privacy, maybe we're taking a little, but it's because this is the right outcome. You know, this is the whole game of the outcome. You know, the end point justifying the means, and I think that's ever, especially in these kind of contexts, is not the right path. You know, and another point I think is important to overlap, that actually interestingly overlaps with Levitt and Ukraine, is the idea that the global aspect of this, you know, the idea of Ukraine and actually Israel being very prominent problems in all of this in regard to the, you know, the very dark kind of side of the adoption level we're talking about here, where you have children being taken from war zones, or even just families that they don't think are fit. And this happens a lot in those countries. But the idea that it was Levitt who is being charged with, it was at least being charged with human trafficking because of the adoption from Ukraine, you know, and then overlapping that weirdly, that I didn't know before your article, with people like Academy, Blackwater, that are in war zones, that are now interestingly connected, but not to even say that we're proving that Bethany Christian is connected to that, but the interesting pipeline you can see where it wouldn't be hard for them to rationalize the idea of taking children from what they would see as non-Christian locations to places where they would think would be better. And this is that very clearly becomes human trafficking across national lines. And, you know, anyway, I think that's an interesting overlap to consider, that there's a much bigger aspect of this, whether that's Bethany or anybody else. There is a dark side to this in the world. And that is concerning when you start to see these, you know, beginning signs of dishonesty. I think that's important.
Absolutely. And I don't have that evidence yet. I do include in there some quotes from, I think, Tennessee representative who was accusing Bethany Christian Services of being involved in trafficking. Like you said, there is a pipeline that connects from foster care to adoption to Eastern European countries. We've seen this with a number of different instances. So it's something I'm keeping my eye on, and I encourage everybody just to stay tuned to TLAV, because I will have at least one more, maybe a couple more articles on this whole thing. And really the important point, because I'm focusing on Bethany Christian Services because that's what my sources have had experience with, and that's what I'm learning most about. But again, I think this is just symptomatic of a bigger problem. So we you know, they're one piece of a much bigger puzzle, this sort of adoption industrial complex, if you will. In fact, since I've been learning about this, I realized this is a whole nother sector of the truth movement. There's like pages like Adoption Truth and others that are on Instagram and other places that are really keeping up with this. And most of it is families and parents sharing their direct experiences. So if this is interesting to you, please do feel free to reach out to me on that, and I will have more coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's this, we've seen all too many times the pretend altruism, you know, I mean, even with the Epstein overlap, you know, this idea that you're actually philanthropist and you're helping, you know, and it's not to say that everybody out there that is in philanthropy or otherwise that they're immediately the other, you know, but it's clearly a problematic aspect where you see power structures push themselves into those things to, you know, give themselves a veneer of legitimacy or altruism. And on that very point, let's, you know, I don't know how much you want to get into, since I know we're limited on time, but just another article that you've been putting out, which is not necessarily in the series that you've been doing, but it's kind of tangential to that. But this was a conversation about Hamblin, and the same point being that this person is somebody who has been, you know, historically framing himself as the altruistic, you know, religious. And it's, you know, I mean, even going back to things like the Catholic Church, like it's hard for people not to understand that that's a big problem in our society today. So any, you know, ending points on this in this series, let us know what's going on here. The title is New Prosecutor Assigned to Case of Admitted Child Abuser David Hamblin. Riotous charges may be dropped on Thursday.
Yeah, well, so this is just the latest in my series. As Ryan showed earlier, when you look at my author page, you can see some of the series I've done. This is the latest in the Utah ritual abuse case. And I'm happy to report that the charges were not dropped on Thursday. So that's one positive development. Of course, we've been following this since 2022 when the Utah County Sheriff's Office first announced an investigation into what they called ritualized child sex abuse. And we didn't know who it was about. But eventually in 2022, that man that there's on screen, David Hamblin, he was arrested. As Ryan said, he's a disgraced ex-therapist who held peyote circles and is admitted to abusing his own daughters and accused of abusing dozens and dozens of people. And not only him, but a ring of people. So far, though, only him and his ex-wife have been arrested and charged. He's been on house arrest for about the last year now. And as I said, he was arrested in September 2022. So we're going on 2 years here now. Still hasn't gone to trial. Discovery hasn't started, which is supposed to be whenever the defense and the prosecution gets access to all kinds of documents. There's been a lot of foot dragging, and this is unfortunate because, as I reported in my previous articles on David Hamblin, he was originally accused of doing similar things, sodomizing children, sexual abuse, etc., in 2012, and those charges were dismissed in 2014 without prejudice, which means that it wasn't dismissed because of lack of evidence or because he was found not guilty, but because, again, back then there was just procedural problems getting access to documents, and ultimately they had to let him go. So here we are 10 years later, and it seemed very much like that was about to happen again, and it may still happen, but for the moment it hasn't. And so I wanted to put together this report because I've been watching the Hamblin stuff, but like I said, nothing much has been happening. There hasn't been a lot to report. There's a few other people out there in the Utah and kind of Mormon community, because there is an intersection there with the Mormon church, who have been following up with this. And last week they told me about this, that, hey, Hamblin might be getting out on Thursday, May 30th, like if no a prosecutor is assigned to his case, because that's where things have gotten. Coincidentally, Ryan, like the guy who was assigned his case in the prosecutor's office, he got nominated to be a judge and was promoted, and then nobody replaced him. Nobody replaced him on the case. So then the case has just been sitting there, and David Hamblin, like everybody else, has a right to speedy trial. And so his defense is saying, hey, if nobody's going to try him, like you guys got to let him go. And the judge, I think Roger or Robert Griffin, had essentially agreed and said, look, if the prosecutor's office, the Utah prosecutor's office, doesn't assign somebody to this case soon, basically by this Thursday, it's going to be dismissed. So when I heard about this, I figured, we need to write an article, get this out as soon as possible. We put together a graphic with the numbers and the emails of the various prosecutors' office. I called. I know at least a dozen other people called, and I'm hearing more people called. I think we probably had at least 50 calls and emails take place. And literally right before we published this article, they assigned a prosecutor. As we didn't know the name yet, but now we know the name of them, and I will be doing a follow-up piece on this soon. So that's the good news is, and just to kind of end, I guess, on a more positive note, that people taking action, even at the ground level, did have an impact. I don't know if David Hamblin would still be in, facing charges right now if we didn't make these phone calls and send these emails, because they actually did respond to some of the emails and said, thank you for your comment. Just want to let you know we've now assigned a prosecutor. He will be showing up. And sure enough, they showed up, and they are taking over the case now. We'll see if things move along. There are still some worrisome connections that I'll get into in my next piece, because as I've talked about in this overall, for those who know the history, once I started looking at this led me to a whole can of worms about the history of abuse in Utah, the history of abuse in the Mormon church. I had victims come speak to me, like Kate Talley. We did a 2-part investigation, Kate's story. We looked into the history of the Mormon church with Gordon B. Hinckley. We released a tape that had never been before. That's it right there, justice delayed. And so this opened up a lot for us to look into, and there's still more to come. So unfortunately, the reality is that there's a lot of overlap and a lot of connections in Utah with the Mormon church, with the judicial system, and many of those people knew or still know David Hamblin, including some of his neighbors. So there is some concern still that there might be some screwy stuff going on behind the scenes, which is why this delay. But nevertheless, because of the pressure, they acted, and now there is a prosecutor on the case, and I will follow up and let you guys know as we get more updates on this situation.
Well, as always, Derrick, outstanding work. And, the fact that anybody like this in any sense could be the chart, like as they even frame it, the official framing is that you can dismiss it for lack of prosecution. The fact that that's even possible blows my mind. This person is an admitted abuser. And even the past time, the same thing probably happened. And the idea that they got promoted and that weird gap, like the point is, like you're saying, if there wasn't attention, if there wasn't clear people like you going, we see what's happening, somebody needs to step in, it probably just would have quietly passed away like last time. And it's just, there's a real problem here, and so I really hope people will take the time to look into the work you did here, this, multiple part series on the Utah ritualized sexual abuse investigation, justice delayed investigation to Gordon B. Hinckley, as you're highlighting. I mean, it's important stuff that's very real, very provable. So thank you for your work as always, Derrick. And anything you want to end with today, upcoming events you want to shout out that people can check out?
I just want to say one more thing on that last one there, which you were just showing justice delayed, just to kind of, I haven't told you this before, but I'll share it with everybody here in the audience too. I actually recently got an email from the granddaughter of Walton Hunter. I encourage people to go look into that case if you don't know. We released through TLAV a mini documentary about Gordon B. Hinckley, who's one of the former members of his former Mormon president, who is still very, they're seen as saints basically in the church. And we released a mini documentary where he's accused of just numerous things, being involved with young boys and things like that. And Walton Hunter, who is also a member of the church, was involved in that. And I dove deep into that, and we reported on that. His great granddaughter reached out to me and was thankful for that story, and basically said, she's trying to get to the bottom of it and sharing it with her family. And I haven't heard from her since. So if she hears this, I wish you well. But I just want to make that clear that the work is reaching people and it's having an impact.
Absolutely. I mean, on that very note, it's unfortunate I'm sure there's other platforms out there that I'm not seeing, though. Who else out there is talking about this stuff, proving this thing? Can you imagine if Tucker Carlson pointed at this? It's infuriating that this stuff can be there, and we've got some reasonable reach, especially between us, and yet this stuff just kind of flounders. And it's not because people aren't seeing it. That's the point you're making, is that people see it, but the power structure and those that are, I think, sidling up next to it and acting like they're not, are allowing these things to stay quiet and get talked about. And it's not to say that everybody out there who's got reach should be talking about what we think is important, but these are important stories, and it's always that same idea. Like I highlighted this today about the shifting narrative from the corporate media about Israel, where suddenly MSNBC is just saying the things that we've all been proving for decades. And my point is, like, why does it take that channel saying what has been self-evident for decades to suddenly have some people see it? It's always a bad, not that we have an answer for that. It's just always this infuriating reality. So your work is important. It is making a difference, as you know, and I just hope that it can get more reach than that. So, maybe you can stop somebody like Hamble in the future before it comes to after the crimes, so not the sense like, pre-crime idea, but just that we can engage with this, not 10 years later is the point. So thank you for your work, Derrick. Anything else you want to leave us with on the way out?
Thank you, brother. I appreciate the time. I thank everybody who's tuned in. It's been a while for us to catch up, so we had a lot to cover. So I appreciate getting into all this. I would just encourage everybody to learn more about the Summit of the Future and pay attention to what's coming in September. Spread the word about that. Stop believing in politics. Keep up with the Hamblin case, and stay tuned for my next piece on the Bethany Christian Services.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Derrick. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.